Now add first-person primary material engagement and deepen the precursor segment slightly. Close enough to target. Let me add one more small expansion to the dead-end synthesis for depth and verify final TTS cleanliness. Length, capital cluster, and punctuation checks all pass. Final script, somewhere on a short stretch of the Japanese coastline sit a handful of chemical plants, and every leading edge chip on the planet, traced back far enough, ends there, not in a clean room in Taiwan, not in a lab in California, but at a few tanks of liquid chemistry. If China cannot buy its way onto that stretch of coast, the real question is whether it can lay a parallel line of its own before the door on the old one finishes closing. A breakthrough in this story is rarely a faster transistor. It is a line rerouted around a node that used to be a dead end on the map, and photoresist is the cleanest version of that idea I have traced. Start at a finished wafer, the kind that becomes a processor or a memory chip once it is cut apart. Look closely at its surface, and you see lines etched so fine that a few of them could fit across the width of a human hair, over 100 laid side by side. Those lines did not arrive by etching alone. Before any etching tool touched the wafer, a thin liquid film called photoresist was spun across it, exposed to light through a mask, then washed away in precise places, leaving the pattern that every later step depends on. Follow the line back from the pattern, and you land on the resist itself, the material that decided where the chip's structure would and would not exist. Walk through what actually happens to that one wafer before it reaches you. It rolls into the coating chamber, and a few drops of photoresist land at its center. Then the wafer spins fast enough that the liquid spreads itself into a film thinner than a soap bubble, often well under 1/1000th of a millimeter thick across the whole disk. Light passes through a mask and changes the chemistry inside the exposed regions of that film. A developer solution then washes away either the exposed or the unexposed resist, depending on the chemistry chosen, and what is left behind is the pattern, the only thing standing between a blank wafer and a working chip. Coat, expose, develop, 3 steps, and every one of them depends on a resist that behaves exactly the same way, batch after batch, because a transistor pattern with even slightly inconsistent edges is a transistor that may not switch reliably at all. For the most demanding layers, the kind that define the smallest transistors on the most advanced processors, the formulation work concentrates in a small cluster of Japanese chemical makers. Shin-Etsu Chemical, Tokyo Ohka Kogyo, and JSR, with Fujifilm among the adjacent suppliers, have for years supplied what industry reporting describes as the overwhelming majority of the specialty resist that advanced fabs actually qualify and run. This is not a generic plastic you can swap from a catalog. Each formulation is tuned to one exposure wavelength and one process node, and changing suppliers means requalifying an entire production line from nothing, a cost most fabs would rather not pay even when an alternative technically exists. Picture the resist cluster as the one valve a city's whole water system runs through. You can lay every pipe downstream that you like, but until that valve opens, no pattern, no water, reaches the wafer at all. The trace stops here, at the photoresist formulation itself, and the junction reads as a chokepoint with no bypass at the leading edge, held by a small named cluster concentrated almost entirely inside one country. Follow the resist sideways now, not forward toward the chip, but down into what the resist is actually built from. A finished canister of photoresist is not a raw material. It sits on top of specialty gases, photoacid precursors, and ultra-pure solvents that have to be sourced and blended before the formulation exists at all. And this is the layer people skip past because it reads as plain chemistry rather than technology. The precursor chemicals and process gases that feed, resist production, form their own narrow supply chain, some sourced inside Japan, some from a small number of suppliers elsewhere, with purity specifications tight enough that changing a single precursor source can change how the finished resist behaves once it hits a wafer. A contamination level measured in parts per billion, a quantity so small it is roughly equivalent to 1 drop of a particular impurity in an Olympic-sized swimming pool, can be enough to throw off how the chemistry reacts to light. Think of this layer as the water table beneath a town's wells. Dig a new well wherever you like, but if the aquifer's mineral content underneath is wrong, every well you sink produces water nobody can actually use for the job that water was meant to do. The choke point here is less a single company name and more a body of tacit knowledge, the accumulated sense of which precursor purity, which photoacid generator, which solvent blend turns raw chemistry into a resist that performs. The trace stops here, at the precursor and specialty gas layer feeding the resist, and the junction reads as a choke point with no bypass, not because the raw chemicals are impossible to find elsewhere, but because the formulation knowledge that turns them into a qualified resist sits with that same small cluster. Follow the line out of the chemistry now and into the paperwork, because none of this reaches a Chinese fab unless it is also legal to ship there. Japan has, in step with chip technology export controls led by the United States, tightened restrictions across a range of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and in various measures has extended scrutiny to chemical inputs tied to the most advanced nodes. I want to be precise rather than confident here, because the exact scope has shifted across several rounds of policy. Reports describe Japan aligning its controls with the broader effort led by the United States, but the specific resist grades covered and how strictly licensing gets enforced in practice are not something I can state with the certainty of a dated regulation, so I will not invent one. What is established is the direction of travel, that the same alignment which restricted lithography tool exports has reached down into the chemical layer underneath those tools, with licensing decisions handled case by case rather than through a single blanket ban, which itself shapes how the choke point behaves. A blanket ban is a wall you either clear or do not. A case-by-case license is closer to a toll booth that can wave one shipment through and hold the next one for review, which makes the choke point slower to map and harder to plan around than an outright prohibition would be. Picture a bridge that was never closed outright, only narrowed lane by lane, where traffic that used to cross freely now waits at an inspection point that did not exist a few years ago. That inspection point, not the bridge itself, is the actual choke point. The trace stops here, at the export licensing junction governing this chemistry, and the junction reads as a choke point with no real bypass, since China cannot simply purchase its way around a licensing requirement, only route a different chemistry behind it. Follow the line into China itself now, to the domestic chemical makers who have spent years trying to build resist production that owes nothing to the Japanese cluster. Chinese photoresist producers working on resists for mature and mid-tier process nodes have, according to industry reporting, made real and reportedly qualified progress at less demanding nodes, the kind used across cars, appliances, and a large share of ordinary consumer electronics. That is a genuine bypass for a meaningful share of China's total chip output, and it deserves to be counted as one, not waved away. But follow that same line out toward the leading edge, toward the resist tuned for the shortest wavelength lithography, and the picture changes. There is no confirmed, independently verified domestic equivalent running at volume for that grade. Reports suggest domestic work on resist for that tier exists in trials or early qualification, and I am not going to dress a trial up as a finished bypass when nobody has confirmed qualified volume output. A domestic resist that works fine for a trailing chip but not for the leading edge is like a back road that gets you comfortably to the edge of town and then stops dead at a river with no bridge across it. Useful for most journeys, useless for the one journey that actually needed the far bank. The trace stops here, at China's own resist makers, and the junction reads as already routed around for mature node chemistry, but still a choke point with only a partial bypass under construction once the line reaches the leading edge. When I went looking through Shin-Etsu Chemical's own publicly filed investor materials, the advanced resist business sits as a small line inside a much larger electronics chemicals segment, overshadowed in the reporting by silicones and other bulk products that bring in far more revenue. Most coverage of chip choke points skips straight past that filing, because a quiet line item in a chemical company's report does not photograph the way a lithography machine does, and that gap between how small this node looks on a balance sheet and how large it looms on the actual manufacturing line is, to me, the whole story in miniature. My own read on this whole node is that Photoresist gets less attention than the lithography machines it feeds, because a liquid does not photograph the way a hulking piece of steel does. But a scanner with no certified chemistry to run through it is just expensive furniture, sitting in a clean room, which means this chemical node may matter as much as the tool it serves, even if it never makes a headline on its own. Here is a hypothesis I want to test on the rest of this map as the story keeps moving. Chemical export alignment between Japan and the United States may turn out harder for China to route around than equipment controls were, because you cannot stockpile a shelf-stable workaround for a resist whose recipe shifts from one process node to the next, the way you can warehouse spare parts for a machine that does not change its design every cycle. Now, the dead end. The strongest case for reading leading-edge resist as a genuine dead end, not for a quarter or a year, but for years at a stretch, is that it is not one chemical waiting to be copied, but an entire qualified system, photoacid generator chemistry, ultra-pure precursors, and process recipes tuned in lockstep with the scanners themselves, built through more than a decade of iterative qualification between resist makers and tool makers working side by side. Replicating that takes more than a formula on paper. It takes years of co-development with fabs running the very scanners China currently has limited access to, since those tools sit under the same export restrictions that gate the chemistry. The strongest case that a bypass still arrives is that chemistry, unlike a multi-billion-dollar lithography tool, does not demand the same scale of capital or decades of accumulated manufacturing tooling. It demands lab access, repeated iteration, and qualified test wafers to fail on and learn from. China has already shown in the mature node resist story that it can close a chemistry gap once it commits sustained investment and tolerates years of underperforming yield while a formulation matures, and reports of trial stage work at the leading edge suggest that effort is already underway, even without a confirmed volume result yet. Both of those readings can be true in the same breath. The dead end is real today, because this chemistry has to be grown alongside tools China cannot fully reach yet, and it is not necessarily permanent, because chemistry gaps tend to close faster than tooling gaps once a country actually commits to closing them, which makes this less a wall on the map than the slowest junction still left to clear, the kind that does not yield to a single large investment so much as to a few thousand patient, unremarkable test runs. Pull back now and read the whole map at once. Mature node photoresist chemistry has been routed around, with domestic Chinese suppliers reportedly qualified and already supplying that tier, which removes one entire category of dependency on the Japanese cluster, and that is a real result, not a footnote. But leading-edge resist, the precursor and specialty gas chemistry underneath it, and the export licensing layer governing legal access to the Japan-aligned supply all remain live choke points with no confirmed bypass at the volume the leading edge actually requires. My plain call is that this network has not closed into self-sufficiency. Not yet. And chemistry choke points like this one are exactly where I would keep watching next, because closing them does not need a single breakthrough machine announced on a stage. It needs years of unglamorous formulation work that never shows up the way a new chip launch does. Every line on this map still passes through a few tanks of liquid chemistry mixed along a short stretch of Japanese coastline. And the day that stops being true will not arrive with an announcement. It will just quietly show up one day in a wafer that nobody flagged as special. So which junction on this map do you think gives way next? The resist chemistry itself or the scanner it depends on? And on what kind of timeline do you expect to see it? Tell me your red in the comments. Subscribe if you want the next node traced, and turn on notifications so you catch it the moment it goes up.